I was just told that it was okay. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, definitely.
All right. Wonderful. All right. Good evening. Thank you for attending this virtual barbershop talk on the law and racial healing. My name is Kwami Abdul-Bey. I am one of the co-conveners of the Arkansas Peace and Justice Memorial Movement. And I am privileged to have three strong brothers with me this evening to talk about the law and racial healing. And we are going to do this to just let you guys know, we're going to do it in a barbershop format. This is not your mother's panel discussion. So the discussion will be as lively and go left, right, however it goes based on what we're talking about. So the first 40 minutes, we will talk amongst ourselves about the law and racial healing. And then the second 40 minutes, we will invite the attendees who are watching to join us in the conversation. To tell you guys a little bit about what this program is about. 7 years ago, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation created an initiative called Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. And that initiative brought forth the National Day of Racial Healing, which is observed the Tuesday after Martin Luther King Day. And it's been done for the last 7 years. 5 years ago, my wife Clarice and I, we began to observe the National Day of Racial Healing here in the state of Arkansas. However, we decided that doing this one day was not enough. So we decided to do a week's worth of observances. And that has gone very well. This year, we have 19 different free events, some virtual, some hybrid, and some in person. And we ask you to go to our website, www.apjmm.org, and look at our calendar and definitely check out the events and get as many as you can under your belt, because the information that we're putting out here is valuable information. For those of you that cannot do that, all of the events are recorded and they will be available on our APJMM YouTube channel within 24 to 48 hours after the event. This particular event, we have three brothers, and I'm gonna give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. But I wanna let everyone know that once you prove yourself with a question, comment, or suggestion that moves the conversation forward or takes us a little bit deeper into the rabbit hole, you will be rewarded with 3 different free books. These brothers are authors, and each of these brothers, we have purchased their books. Two books are forthcoming, but one is here, and you will receive a copy of each of those books. So I want to start by allowing Dr. Mitchell to introduce himself. And I want to do that because Dr. Mitchell used to live here in Arkansas, and we've broken bread many times together. So I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Mitchell to introduce himself. Please go ahead.
Well, it's a pleasure to be back at the Reconciliation Day celebration. I was at the very first one. In fact,
yes, you were
opening speaker for the very first one that Arkansas did.
2019.
Yes, and I've been participating ever since. My name is Brian Mitchell. I was formerly a tenured professor of history at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. I am currently the director of research, and I might add, the first African-American director of research for the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum.
Wonderful. Next, I want to go to Dr. Wilson, and I'm choosing Dr. Wilson because Dr. Wilson, I saw something on, it was it was on Twitter, and someone posted something and they mentioned you, Dr. Wilson. And so I immediately looked you up and I'm like, I need to know this brother. So I said, I am going to invite him to be a part of this conversation. And if he becomes a part of it, we're going to be friends. And it was about 2 or 3 hours after I sent the email inviting him, he immediately responded.
Yes.
And he said, I'm down. So Dr. Wilson, please introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. I'm glad that Twitter has been a meeting space for Black folk, not just us, but honestly, Black people that have not had access to college, to law school, to graduate school, to be able to engage in these conversations that affect, the organization of Black living and dying. So I'm Dr. T. Anansi Wilson. You can see my first book that I wrote in law school here on the screen. Kwami is going to distribute it. It's also available on Amazon. It's called Godless, Circumcisions. Recollecting and Remembering a Blackness, Queerness, and Survivance. From the title, you can probably get I'm a Black queer person. So I'm from Kansas City, as you can see from the hat. I did my undergrad at Tufts University, studying critical race theory, intersection of race, law, and power, and sexuality. Did my PhD in Black Studies at UT Austin. And then in my law degree, before I did my law degree at Howard University, the home of the social engineers and the civil rights movement. And so I generally study the intersections of race, law, and sexuality, thinking about how the afterlives of slavery continue to animate and infect constitutional law, and the ways in which Black people regard each other in our own communities, Black people, Black queer people, Afro-Latinx people, but also how whiteness orients itself toward policing Black life and Black living and dying. And I recently founded and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Black Life and the Law at Mitchell Hamline School of Law. It's the only center in American history at a law school that is audacious enough to focus explicitly on the ways in which the law orders and disorders Black and Black queer living and dying. So I'm happy to be here with all of you tonight.
Wonderful, thank you. And finally, Dr. McCreary. Dr. McCreary, I learned about him from the Sisters in Virginia with the Coming to the Table. For those of you who do not know about Coming to the Table, here with the Arkansas Peace and Justice Memorial Movement, we are the Arkansas chapter of a national organization called Coming to the Table. And Coming to the Table connects the descendants of the enslaved with descendants of the enslavers, so that we can start conversations to begin to heal America. And there is a very powerful group of Coming to the Tablers in Virginia, and they talk about Dr. McCreary on a regular basis. So I reached out to them and asked them to connect me, and they told me, well, he's not even in the United States right now. I said, well, just send them an email and tell them what we're doing. And you were out of the country and you responded and said, I'm down. So Dr. McCreary, please introduce yourself.
It's good to be here. All honor to the Most High in all ways that we worship the Most High. I guess I use 5 Ps to kind of talk about who I am. First, I'm a partner for 40 years now to an African-American woman who has really just shaped me. I'm the parent to a 31-year-old African-American daughter. That's cool. I am, I don't know how to get brother and son in there, but I'm the oldest of 7 children born to the late Reverend James McCreary and the matriarch, Shirley J. Northcutt McCreary. I'm also a professor of psychology, was a tenured professor at a school in Richmond and left there in 2014. I'm also a licensed clinical psychologist. I do that work, and I've been a pastor of a church, different churches, since about 30 years. And that's kind of me. And now I'm president of a seminary.
Busy man.
Not as much as I used to be. I used to do those all at the same time, bro. At least now, they in the past. I'm just doing one of them. So, which is why I could write on my 30 years of life as dealing with trauma and race. Really, all of my life dealing with that trauma and race.
Well, let's start there. We're talking about the National Day of Racial Healing. And the National Day of Racial Healing, the overarching principles are truth, racial healing, and transformation. One thing that we have found is that Black people are a traumatized people. Can you speak on that trauma and how that trauma relates to and affects healing? And remember, we are in a barbershop discussion, so please do not mute yourselves or hesitate to talk. Go ahead, Dr. McCreary.
Yeah, when I think about that, I have to go back to, I guess, my beginnings in Detroit, Michigan, where I was raised, and a wonderful father, powerful. I mean, I walk like him, I look like him, I got the big nose like him. He was my guy, you know. And then they had the riots in Detroit in '67 and again in '68. And he flipped, he switched, it just something happened. And at that time, as a 10-year-old, I didn't really know what it meant. But he left us, abandoned us, and it really, trauma happened because when I lost my dad, the house next to us was blown up, just kind of crazy stuff. And I grew up with that, and it just took a lot of time to deal with it. And to flip the story way far ahead, I reconnected with my dad while I was in college, and we became friends. And then had a conversation in '85 at my mother's home in Detroit about what had happened to him, what had been going on. And he shared, and I told him, look, Dad, it's too late for you to be my father, but let's be friends. And then he died February 14th of '86. Fast forward, now when that happened, I was literally a youth pastor and in seminary. Fast forward to '93 for me, I've been finishing up my PhD in psychology. I'm leaving Philadelphia to come back to Virginia to be a professor at Virginia Commonwealth University. And I find a letter my father had written in '86, right before he died. And I just, maybe it was pain back in '86. I didn't read it, but I hadn't opened it or read it. I read it then, and he talked about the fact that he had been tortured in the Korean War, and how the riots had messed him up, the revolts, as I call them, had messed him up in Detroit. But he had now found out what he wanted to be. My dad, in '86, said in that letter, he wanted to be a psychologist because it was helping him to heal. Now, without knowing that, I've now become that. And I'm like, okay, all right. That to me was some healing that we could spend some time with, but that's how I look at it. The trauma was there in the loss and all the things that happened in the in-between time, you know, poverty, all with my mom having to work, things that went on, brother going to jail for murder, a lot of stuff in there. And all that happens, and then I wind up, boom, I'm a healer now, you know, so.
Trauma, particularly like you just described how your father just disappeared. And, you know, without explanation, we have a lot of Black men that just disappear.
Yeah.
The disappearance. And it's interesting because today we had a panel discussion with 12 African dignitaries. And during that conversation, something was said because we were talking about transitional justice. And someone mentioned about families disappearing.
Yeah.
How does disappearance, and anybody can answer this question, how does disappearance relate to trauma? Because I think might be a two-sided coin, right?
I think it's more than two sides. Okay. I think that there's a vacuum that's created at that disappearance, both emotionally, particularly when you're talking about a parent, and financially. My father was arrested when I was a child, falsely accused of murder, and spent my entire life in prison. So I don't have any recollections of him as a child because he was arrested when I was a babe in arms. And, so there's that void that existed, that relationship that was truly non-existent for the two of us. But then there's also that economic void that my mother had to fill, that time void that she had to fill. And those leave emotional scars. And then in talking about disappearances, my mother started going to school in Chicago. She realized I've got to take care of my children. She moved to Chicago. Her brother's murdered in the early 1970s, in what's billed as the last lynching in New Orleans, right? So we moved back to attend the trials and to see to my grandmother, who, her baby boy was killed. And his girlfriend, he was a college student at Southern University. His girlfriend's pregnant at the time. So once again, that child was born with a vacuum. Just like I had never known my father because of his incarceration. She had never known her father because of that vacuum created by that murder. So I think that in the African American community, there are a lot of people that suffer from these vacuums. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of associated pain that most people don't understand unless you're in that community. That's always having to give up things for the sake of, and for all these injustices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, so I agree with both Dr. McCreary's earlier statement, but also with Dr. Mitchell's experience and statement right here. But I also think for me, being like a Black queer person, it's been interesting to think about absence and trauma. I think we generally think about trauma and absence as a marker of theft, which it can be, and which it often is, right? Almost always is, right? And we also think about it as a negative experience. But I will say for me, growing up, being raised on my mother, my maternal grandmother, and my sister's grandparents as well, and my great-grandmother, my great-grandparents, the absence of my father, after getting to know them later when I was 16, meeting them randomly in the Kmart, actually was a beautiful thing. Mm-hmm. I did not have a model of patriarchy to follow. There wasn't this idea that men had to be everything at any moment to every person, right? I watched my grandmother work at a 3M factory, 14 hours a day. Also, someone who was previously involved with the Black Panther Party, taught me how to shoot when I was 7 years old, right? So I never looked at women as—
Wait a minute, your grandmother taught you how to shoot?
Oh, Willa Mae. I'm surprised he's not watching this right now, but yeah, listen. And my great-grandmother's
Negroes with guns, man.
Listen, this is Kansas, all right? So everybody shoots. But my great-grandmother's nickname was Pistol Packin' Ella, right? And so, they call my grandma Willa Mae Wild Willa. And so, for me, though, it became important to think about as a child, what is this intersection between race and gender? What am I made to do? And also, who am I allowed to be? And because I was raised by women, and my uncles as well, but they're also being raised in a type of matriarchy, I didn't have these rules of what it meant to be a man, and that was not imposed upon me. And I understand that for other Black queer people, particularly for Black LGBT folks that are teenagers and preteens, we have the highest homelessness rates. We have the highest suicide rates. And oftentimes that's because we're forced to believe, we're made to believe, we're disciplined in believing that we must be our fathers or our grandfathers, and take in all the pain of society, take in all the responsibility of society, and show no emotions. So I think that there was obviously a trauma and a theft of my father being present in my life. But at the same time, there was a gift that I think that happened for me to open up gender and open up Blackness to be a type of freedom song and a freedom practice and praxis, but also for my mother and grandmother, who weren't having to compete with power dynamics over who gets authority, who gets to run this house, how do I be a woman? In the absence of the regulation of a patriarch, they're able to be free too. And so we were able to have very free and open conversations about what does it mean to be a partner? What does it mean to be a Black person? What do you do when you're in pain? And how do you lash out? And my lesson was not to be necessarily violent, unless it was defensive. I believe that some violence is legitimate. A lot of violence is legitimate because most of life is violence. But also, what does it mean to emote in a way that is bearing good witness, in the language of James Baldwin? So I want to kind of re-steer us in the kind of notion that all trauma, right, even in the beginning, even though it's a theft, doesn't end in a way that is a dispossession.
Yeah. And the term I use to express that is a soul wound. And so you get the soul wound.
Soul wound?
Yeah, a soul wound. And when it happens, it's from the absence and the presence of things that are there, and you miss something, and that wounding happens there, and it's the healing of that wounding. And I often see that and express that wounding as a gift, which is what you're saying, Dr. Wilson. It's a gift, and it's like without being broken, there is no being made whole. And that's the piece that's there. And so with that soul wound, there's a process of healing it. And we can walk, I got some steps that I use in therapy, but we're getting way ahead, but that's the process. And part of that is actually reflecting on the suffering. That's the third step for me in it. As Dr. Wilson was saying, reflecting on that, really where you learn what are the lessons that were there for me through this experience, because it's a part of life, you know.
And you know, have I been broken? Right. That's the other question, because I think we have this analogy, particularly in my background. When I was growing up, I was, ordained as a coaching minister at 13. So go way back in that life, not there no more. But there's always the analogy about being broken, or the Donnie McClurkin, we fall down, but we get up. But sometimes we actually don't fall down.
You don't
Sometimes
fall
we're actually not broken.
Yeah.
Sometimes you're a diamond being formed, that there was no breaking. You're in a moment of perfection or perfecting your own self. So I think that, like, and that's not to be discursive of what you're saying or to disagree with it, but I think that sometimes it's not either or, maybe it's both and.
Yeah.
Maybe the breaking is part of the creation process.
Yeah.
So is Black excellence wrought out of,
oh Lord,
this resilience to struggle from an early age? So where's the origin of Black excellence lie?
My mentor, both of them, Imani Perry and Christina Sharp, would say that, and have said that, Black excellence is the wrong answer to a racist question.
Right.
Black excellence is the wrong answer to a racist question.
Yes, because the notion that Black people need to be excellent, the notion that anyone can actually be excellent if they really know everything about their lives, right? It plays into this kind of American ideology of meritocracy that we also know is really just nepotism, hidden and carved into anti-Blackness and white supremacy and capitalist hegemonic patriarchy and all those things. So I would say that, like, I really am interested in, I encourage Black mediocrity. You should be able to wake up and not go to work today because you're tired, because you got other things to do. You shouldn't have to be the Black first, the Black top, the Black number one. How about I be the Black 1 millionth? And I still deserve quality food, clean air, the ability to afford my rent, a partner that sees me and I see them, and the space and finances to go to couples therapy, because God knows the world is real and we need to engage in those things. So I try to skew away from Black excellence because it's unattainable in a world that's anti-Black and a climate that's anti-Black, and move into what does it mean for Black people to be the least among us and still be worthy of citizenship and all the accoutrements of that.
I like that.
When we talk about the least among us, that brings in, from my understanding, and then I have to also talk about how I was a ordained minister as a teenager as well. But the words of Yeshua, Jesus, talks about the meek and those downtrodden and everything. How does that come into this conversation? Because I really like the way that you framed that, Dr. Wilson, about Black excellence being the wrong answer. So how do we bring in the ability to just be us and just be, and still be worthy of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in this Judeo-Christian framework where we have white Christian nationalists that think a totally different way?
Mm-hmm. I guess the landed right on.
I thought that was directly addressed to Dr. Wilson.
No, this is a barbershop talk. So
I mean, look, I just keep it a buck. I'll say this. I mean, a lot of my writing thinks about how Blackness has been described as a type of de facto debtor status, right? Blackness as the excess of emotion. Blackness as the excess of need. Blackness as the excess of nuisance, of sound. Even when you're asserting your rights, it's almost as if you're asking for too much, right? So if you think about Blackness as this type of, we think about Supreme Court arguments, Dred Scott, or even Plessy versus Ferguson, where the notion is that Black people, from the Chief Justice says that, the Black man has no rights, the white man is bound to respect, right? And owes service or labor and duty for life. right? This is the Constitution we're talking about. These Supreme Court edicts, right, that live in afterlives as a type of living testimony or will in precedents of judicial law that we understand now. And so I think when we think about like this idea of how do we overcome this, I don't know that we overcome it just on truth-telling, just on bearing good witness, just on protesting and being killed and ready to die. I don't know that there actually is an overcoming. I don't know the future, but I will lean on the words of Derek Bell, the father of critical race theory, that used to tell Kimberly Crenshaw and others that your job is not to solve anti-Blackness. Mm-hmm. Your job is not to solve racism or homophobia or misogyny, right? The kind of sexism that's particularly aimed at Black women or transphobia, but your job is to lay a brick in the wall of justice. Right. And so that's what I kind of see this work as, is not overcoming an overwhelming system that you as 9% of society, right, can't just rise up and abolish, but it's finding ways in which to be a social engineer, as Charles Hamilton Houston would say, right? How are you socially engineering a world that is less fixated, not necessarily not fixated at all, but less fixated on consuming Black life as fuel? Right? Less consumed on your neighbor's duty, thinking about the Fugitive Slave Act, being about disordering and ordering Black living and dying. How do you do that at work? How do you practice that with your partner? Where are you being anti-Black at home with your children, right? We talk about Black respectability. We tried it, but we also understand that also leads to Black suicide and Black anti-Black policing, whether it's about professionalism, whether it's about whether you need a locks or a fade, whether it's about whether your afro is allowed with the Crown Act in California. Right. So I think that oftentimes we think about these as just these overwhelming systemic barriers. And we're not thinking about the ways in which we become the anti-Black police in our own households, in our relationships with our children, and obviously in bids, right, to protect kids from the world outside that's going to be even more violent than us. My grandmother used to say that, I whip you, not because I hate you, because I love you. And I don't want the world to kill you, so I want you to be ready. But why do I have to be whipped in order to not die?
Right.
Right? Where's the conversation? Because 5-year-old Black children are still humans, able, willing, and excited to learn. Right? So where do we take that anti-Blackness out of our Black life as practice? So that's how I would kind of think about and intervene with that question.
I love what you said, but I still grasp onto like Baldwin's idea that we're in a landscape that isn't constructed for us. It hasn't evolved over time. It's adapted. And those are two different things. It hasn't moved. There hasn't been forward progress. And a lot of times people point to laws that have been written and they say, well, now you have voting rights. We're constantly having that same struggle every election. And there's still, from the onset till today, there's still people who believe that they could revoke the right to vote, or the 13th Amendment, or the 14th Amendment. So the idea that there's been some forward progress, we live in a society that hasn't conceived a place for us. And our purpose largely in that constructed landscape is the same, labor. So how do we transcend that is my question for brothers. If we live on a monopoly board where all the players have been playing and all the money's stacked on opposing teams, how do you reconstruct when you don't have autonomy, you don't have wealth, you don't have unity even all the time? How do you take apart a system that is bent on your exploitation?
I was actually reading Shelby Steele yesterday. Just don't ask me why. I had to go listen to him, and found some sanity in his insanity when he was saying, that this affirmative action thing has really hurt us more than it's helped us. And I think about my healing happening when I left a white university and went to Virginia Union University and hanging out there and being embraced. And the thing I came out of there with were a couple of things. Number one was that my job in the system is to till around the tree, to prune it, to harvest it, and to help it grow. It's not my tree. And I think that was the piece that really got me. It's like almost a Native American piece where it's not mine. I can't own this, but
Right.
I'm gifted to work with this, to get my hands dirty in the soil until the growth happens. And I think what I heard Steele saying was that that's what we've been doing as people of color, for a long time before there was any movement. We were making the firmaments of the pieces, doing the blood work, doing the things that we were doing as people of color, as Black people, long before we got free legally. We go back to the law piece, that we were already free, and then we got free and then became in bondage. That's what he's saying. I wanted to play with that. I could play with that some more. The second piece for me is it's not what you do that matters. It's what you do with what's been done. And I live with that. It's like, whether it's, whatever I get, it's not what I do, it's my next move. It's my next move to what's been done that really matters.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I love that kind of analogy. And, I just kind of sit with the old Williams Brothers song, you got to sweep around your own front door before you sweep around somebody else's. So I think a lot of this isn't just this big question of how do you change the United States of America, or how do you change the whole Black universe, right? The whole African diaspora, Black people in the United States, or even African Americans, now I'm thinking about Caribbean Americans or African immigrants or Black Americans or African Americans. How do you even do that? And part of that is like being a model, right? Because Christina Sharp wrote this book called In the Wake, and she's thinking about the wake as the wake of ripples on the ocean, right? And each wake is a kind of response to a movement. Which movement are you going to be that people respond to?
Yeah.
And so I think about, to your point, the kind of enslaved ancestors and what choices, I shouldn't even say choice, because choice employs agency. What decisions did they make under duress? And there were folks that said, I will live and not die. Right. And I will deal with all these indignities. But other folks said, life is nothing without dignity, and jumped from these slave ships in the Atlantic, or purposely did things that they knew would get them killed while they were on this land. Right.
Or commit infanticide.
Exactly, right. We can think about Margaret Garner, right, and the kind of precursor to Beloved, and Prigs versus Pennsylvania as well, right? This idea that like I'd rather my child be dead than to be the living dead on this kind of plantation situation, right? So we can think about that as well. And I think that's a lot to deal with, but I would push back a little bit and say that, affirmative action, what I like to call, I think the appropriate term is corrective action, has not helped us. I think in my own situation, if I wasn't very clear about the fact that I'm, applying to school, right, as a first generation high school graduate of a mother that's 100% deaf in one year, 85% deaf in the other, I may not have gotten a full ride to go to the school that I went to, even though I had great test scores, right? But that type of corrective action program allowed a type of window into the reality of like, what did it even take for them to get a perfect ACT, right? Because I'm not the only Black person who gets a perfect ACT score, right? You can choose among us. So I will push back and say that I think that corrective action does provide for many of us to begin to bear witness publicly, right, in ways that cannot be ignored via our credentials, to speak to the truth of the matter asserted, that Black people have been intentionally and are continually intentionally living in the conditions of the afterlives of slavery. So I think that, like,
push with that, to agree with you wholeheartedly. Psychologically, there were two principles in the testing. There was the G factor and the S factor. And they felt that the G factor made sure it ruled out all the Black folks. So that became the key factor. And they left the other generalized factor out. And so I have no question that I disagree with it. I'm just saying that it was deep that I'm reading that stuff before walking into this moment, and so I'm with you, in other words.
Yeah, and I mean, I just would say that, we actually need white people to correct their actions of the past.
Yeah.
This is your duty. So I don't want to get into this line of thinking that lets white people off the hook and says, well, affirmative action, and we know, was better for white women than anybody else. We can say that to be very clear. But that also doesn't mean that it wasn't good in correcting some sliver of institutional racism, misogyny, and all these types of things, right? That just means you didn't do it right, because you didn't do it with clear intent. You didn't do it with anti-Blackness in mind. You did it with the type of performativity that allowed some of us to slip into the cracks and then cause havoc in your schools.
Right.
And
but when you control the system and you make the rules and you make the policies, all policies
And the tests.
yeah, are meant to do exactly what you described.
That's right.
To give you a sliver of benefit, but then give the bulk of the benefit to someone who they see as deserving. That's outside of your group.
That's right. And to think about Black people, though, we've survived the Middle Passage.
Yep.
Many of us did. Many of us did not, let's be clear. We survived slavery. Many of us did, many of us did not. We survived Jim Crow and mass incarceration. If we can do these things with no privilege, with no recognition, under the cover of dark and under the surveillance of policing and white neighbors and Black respectable neighbors, what then can we do with the actual credentials, support, resources, and finances? So every Black person that comes through corrective action, right, is not going to be able to, and I don't think it's human, honestly, to be able to overcome white supremacy and anti-Black disease institutions. But enough of us can, given the opportunity, just a little bit of privilege, just a little bit of money or coins, as my little nephews like to say, can come up into school and whip some things into order. I mean, I'm sure both of you have been in institutions where they didn't know that you were going to be who you said you were going to be, right? But because by virtue of what you looked at, but what you are, and also your credentials, you were able to slide in there and create some institutional, organizational, and intellectual change that they weren't.
Try.
But I think even the trying plants a seed in ways with staff, faculty, or whatever organization you're in that the folks that hired you was not prepared for, right? Sometimes we're not.
I think that there's an expectation. There's an expectation if you go through the gauntlet, then you're vetted in such a way that you're not going to be a problematic Negro. You can say that. He's been vetted in such a way that he's okay to come here. And I think a lot of times when they realize that, no, you're not, just because you've gone through those hoops doesn't mean that you've conformed.
That's right.
Or you've been altered in some material way. And you still have the same grievances, and you bring those grievances to these ivory towers, so to speak. They're not always welcome. And very quickly, the door that once welcomed you in, very quickly closes behind you.
And for me, the tower doesn't recognize that, to use the David Goliath story, that they don't know, where we were and what we brought to that battle. And not knowing that, there's no way they can anticipate what the outcome's going to be. For me, it's sitting on that crystal stair, and hearing my mother say, "Don't you sit there, you get up," because and you keep climbing. I mean, even if it's wood or it's nails, it's tacks, it's no carpet, you keep climbing, and that's been the corrective action for me. Even before I got to the institution where correction action, that they made the mistake to let me in where they didn't want me to be in, which is a cool piece, yeah.
But that's why I started the conversation with that discussion of resilience, because it all comes back to that individual resilience. Would you have had that resilience had it not been for that mother who created it in you largely out of vacuums? I don't want you to stop. I don't want you to be in those dark corners. I don't want you to, there's going to be places where there's no boards,
Social learning theory would say, yeah.
Who knows? I mean, I think my mother is a very loving and fragile person. We literally were driving down the highway, and my mother has very high anxiety. This is the first time she drove on a highway. It was terrifying. But we saw someone literally walking down the road in Kansas City who didn't have a coat on. My mother, who's gripping the steering wheel, you can see her veins in her hands going 30 miles per hour in a 75-mile lane, stops the car to give this person her coat, right? And I think about that, and I think about also my mom was very non-confrontational. And, if it wasn't for her, would I still be the very confrontational person I am? Yes, thank God for my grandmother. But at the same time, there's this kind of sweetener to it that is my mother's capacity, overwhelming capacity for inexhaustible care, right? And I think we have to think about that too as a type of Black carry-on tradition. And for some people, carry-on tradition means live to fight another day. For other people, it means that your love was betrayed today, your trust was betrayed today. Live on, love on. believe on, on tomorrow. And I think about, thinking about both what Dr. Mitchell and Dr. McCreary were saying a moment ago, that County Cullen poem. Hey, Black child, do you know who you are?
Yeah.
Do you know who you really are? Do you know what you can do or what you would do? And we think about that, it's just like, do you really know the expansive history and capacity of your ancestors to choose life, to choose death, to choose infanticide, to choose to not our choices today are we gonna get fired?
Yeah.
Or the police gonna
Isn't that the sort of beauty of
different choice?
Isn't that the beauty of us as a people, though, to always have hope despite the past, to always look forward, to always be progressive, to never sit on that stair, as you pointed out, to always be willing to get back up in the fight.
Well, Dr. Wilson, you said something earlier about agency, and I have a question for all three of you, is where does agency play in hope for Black America?
I think we've gotten a little soft. I think about Ida B. Wells, and I think about what does it mean to be 26 years old during slavery, to go down and, just after the dawn of slavery as well, at the end of slavery rather, and to go down and be the first Black woman to own and co-own a newspaper, the first Black woman journalist, first Black person really doing this work, and to say, I'm going to write against the law. I'm going to write about the ways that Black men and women are being lynched and dismembered and dealing with mastectomies and penectomies and all these things lit on fire in the lie of service of white cis heteropatriarchy, in the lie in service of the kind of innocence of white women. And when she did this, she wasn't worried about whether she was going to get fired from a job. She wasn't just thinking about whether the police were going to rough her up. She understood that this was a life and death mission that was bigger than her own life or death. It was about the living and dying of hundreds of thousands of Black people that would be burned alive, that would be lynched, that would have body parts cut off, that would have their backs whipped into the image of a cherry choked tree. And she continued to go. And she continued to carry on, knowing that as a woman, she wasn't just risking murder or lynching. She's also listing a type of sexual violence and sexual mutilation that isn't readily available in the same ways, even though sometimes it happened to Black men, right? And women having no legal rights at this time. So I juxtapose that with and I think that other people are taking very serious risks. I don't want to discard that. But I think I juxtapose that with what's happening with Generation X, sometimes my millennial peers, Gen Z, about our fears of being reprimanded by a manager, our fears of being roughed up. And I think that being killed by police is a real fear, but these fears of reduction in salary, of not getting our next job, that really pale in comparison to what folks like Ida B. Wells or Fannie Lou Hamer or Frederick Douglass or Du Bois or Thurgood Marshall, right, really were up against in a daily risking and, a more likely than not chance that you will be killed and tortured today. So I think that sometimes we really have to sit with the fullness of our history, the fullness of the courage. And I think to Dr. Brian Mitchell's point, whether it's about a hopefulness for life or a pessimism that says you'll never get your right way, so risk it all, right? What do you have to lose? And I don't think we sit with that enough.
We also discount, I think you're also discounting the effect of the creation of the moral Black majority under Nixon. And this is creating a modern Black middle class that is in some way geographically distant from the Black poor urban elite or the Black poor urban masses. And in creating that, you create this world that they can live in and believe that somehow they're better off because of material things. We go to the same school. We can walk down the street and go to our Starbucks, and I've got this Ivy League education, and that's created it's an illusion largely that's created an illusion of respectability, an illusion of and we all come to these points where there are lines in the sand. That we have to make our own personal decisions. Can I, can a man live by bread alone? And how much does this job really mean to me?
Mhm.
Are questions I think that Blacks ask themselves all the time. I think a lot of people have grown, like you said, comfortable with seeing the suffering and injustices sometimes in the workplaces and looking the other way and saying, I got bills to pay. And that's just a reality, I think, that we deal with. But I saw a lot of courage from students during the George Floyd protests. And when you said, well, I think we kind of gotten soft, I used to think the same thing until I saw, the fervor at which students and young people were going out there and protesting on a daily basis and not giving up. And that renewed my hope that, there can be change.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we don't have time to unpack it, but I think also to that conversation, the two issues of one of genetic transmission, of the trauma, and the other is the contextual transmission, that there is some of it that's passed on, however we want to look at it, but the science has shown that to be the case, that some of the trauma of previous generations is transmitted to us somehow. And it gets there. I think then context also does it, which is where the triggering happens, it happens. And that also impacts this conversation and in ways, so.
Yeah, I would push back, so I don't agree.
I can see it.
Not on you, Dr. McCreary, on Dr. Mitchell, because we're having fun over here.
Oh.
On the notion that I'm overlooking the impact of Nixon and, his administration and kind of how this kind of Black Townsend 10th actually comes into fruition. I would say this: there's always been a Black Townsend 10th or a Black Townsend 5 or 1%. We need to look no further than the Deep South with, New Orleans, or what happened historically in Birmingham, where you generally have, richer Black people that actually are free in these kind of slaveocracy states that are actually owning slaves. Right? Or in other ways, right, that are actually like Black free entrepreneurs in the North who are shipbuilders who are actually profiting off of the ships that are built to kind of, actually transport Black people into slavery. So these things are always happening. This isn't new. I don't think Nixon deserves credit. Nixon was just a loud white racist, right? I'm not going to give him credit for that.
No, there is an element of it that is extremely different. And that element is, even though we had Black millionaires, in fact, I'm from a long descendant of free Blacks that had money. So they had plantations, they owned, companies in Ohio. And the difference is they couldn't go to white institutions. They couldn't go to white churches. They couldn't go to white social clubs. So they had to support theirs and they had to live with theirs. And they were the foundation of those very communities. So Black kids came out of school, out of their homes, no matter how poor they were, and they could see Mr. Johnson's plantation or Mr. Johnson's house. And look, if a Black man could have a house like that, then I'm gonna have a house like that one day.
I would disagree with that, though.
The exodus of that Black middle class to the urban suburbs, that totally eradicated institutions in the inner city.
For some, because some of these institutions need to die. Let's be quite clear. I think that you can have the perception, right, that you can be a young Black child and see someone that's a rich Black slave owner and be inspired and say, I one day too can be rich and Black and own and subjugate people. Or you can look at that same person, whether it's a slave owner or a Black entrepreneur, industrialist that is also paying really low wages to Black folks, and say, my God, anti-Blackness has no limits. My God, what does the future look like? And so I think we sometimes get seduced into this notion that Black upper class or middle class prosperity is inspirational. Sometimes that very image is the notion that there is no cap on white supremacy. There is no cap on anti-Black policing. And so I don't know that looking at and seeing that there's these Black well-to-do people is actually inspirational. Sometimes that's probably a foreclosing of people's futures. Sometimes that's probably I have two options. I can be language fucked over by rich white people or screwed by rich white folk. And if the model for Black prosperity is anti-Blackness, my God, what do I do? My God, is the God that I was even taught about, that I prayed to, that I fasted and sacrificed for, even real, is he too anti-Black? Right. And so I think that like there are different ways we have to begin to kind of sit and witness this conversation, because just like I was saying earlier, where sometimes the absence of a Black father is actually a blessing in disguise. Sometimes the absence of the Black middle class and the Black upper class who co-signs anti-Black policing, who co-signs the death and dying and the subordination of low-income Black people is a blessing. And I think that as we talk to a lot of lower class, working class, poor Black people today, and then we look at those through the Freedmen Bureau's records and enslaved narratives, sometimes the safest thing you could do was get the hell away from free Negroes. So we have to also talk about
Charles Chestnut, talks about it, and wife of my youth, Benitha, and Raisin in the Sun. The only thing more prejudiced and prejudiced white people are what? Rich Black people. Rich Black folks.
Gills, I gotta watch y'all Jackson Gills folks sometimes. Y'all be stressing me out.
But what I'm saying is the money that's there, the jobs that are created, and the dependence of that community for the services that are being brought there, whether they're exploitive or not, access to Black-owned groceries, access to Black-owned businesses disappears, largely urban renewal, slum clearance, and then that whole middle class moving entirely out causes another vacuum.
It does, but I don't want the fruit of the poisonous tree, as Thurgood Marshall would say. You might own a grocery store, but I might prefer my grandma's garden, right? So, I think that we have to really think critically about, yes, you're the Black grocer, but what are you doing? How are you treating the Black people that are coming there? And to Dr. McCreary's point, what is the trauma that happens when I go into a Black grocery store and I'm still policed via anti-Blackness, right? Like, what is happening to me and my self-evaluation? And how do I take that frustration out on my partner, on my children, on my mother that's living with me, on the people that are around me, right? Because that trauma, that violence, that subordination, that dispossession goes somewhere. And also to your point though, Dr. Mitchell, like that is not to say that all Black grocers, right? But people are delving in the death dealing sport of Black respectability. Right. Because if respectability is a premium, that means those that cannot afford respectability are disposable and are oil.
But what that meant before Brown is that doctor's kid or that grocer's kid's going to be going to the same school that you're going to. And his philanthropy is going to go to that school to make sure that school is the best school that his kid could possibly go to. And he's going to make sure that the neighborhood is safe because his kids have to walk down that same street. When there are no people that have political agency or wealth left in the community, then you don't have anybody policing on your behalf.
I love your investment in Black altruism. I just grew up too poor on food stamps and fried bologna sandwiches and empty bellies most nights to believe it. So I will say this, when you look at Brown v. Board of Education, look at the children that were the plaintiffs for that, they were in Topeka, Kansas, right? Where most of the Black people that live in Topeka were actually Black professionals. They weren't in where my great-grandmother and them are from in Fort Scott, Kansas, where there are no Black professionals, right? So when we think about Brown v. Board, the schools that were chosen, they were actually chosen very specifically. Thurgood Marshall, if nothing else, was great at shopping cases and shopping clients, and so was that whole movement lawyering issue. That's why they didn't come to Fort Scott. That's why I didn't come to Pittsburgh or Coffeyville, because those Black schools were not picture perfect. And there wasn't some Black student that was overachieving above the white students that could be a model plaintiff. So, I think it's important to think about, yes, where there are Black doctors, it's nice because they're creating a higher tax base and other Black kids are able to come in and maybe if they have the emotional bandwidth of being, discriminated against all day, they can advocate for somebody else. But that's a huge maybe. We see that with other Black leaders that have actually not extended that type of grace or gratitude or social engineering spirit in the modern times, but also during slavery, Jim Crow, and everything that came after it. But also, if we're really thinking about where most Black people live, most Black folks, not just now, but historically, have lived in very poor communities where there isn't a doctor, right? We don't have less Black doctors than we had in 1940, right? They're more diffuse. But there weren't these communities where you have all these Black professionals around Black poor people who are getting free Black Panther-like services. It took the Panthers to say, wait a minute, this is our 10-point plan and food should be free. And it wasn't Black doctors lining up to do these type of work. It wasn't Black chefs lining up. It was Black poor people who were tired of being disabused and undignified and beaten down that said, we're going to police the police. And even before that, we're going to police ourselves to make sure that the basics of nutrition are given to our people. And there wasn't no PhDs for that.
And in addition to that,
I still say that we're both looking through rose-colored glasses, but they're from different vantage points. You're on one hill, I'm on another, and we're both looking.
Twin Peaks, I see you.
Glasses.
Dr. McCreary, you were going to say something?
No, I was just going to say I wear the bow ties because of the Nation of Islam in Detroit, as well as the Panthers, and just the reminder that, you know, even with that kind of teaching, you can get folk who are broken and help them to repair themselves. You know, and that's just, to me, that's a part of the conversation.
Wonderful. We have an attendee that would like to ask a question, so I'm going to bring on Donald Walter so he can ask his question.
Well, thank you, Kwami. I really intended for you to read my question, but there was a comment earlier about the descendants of former slaveholders and the descendants of slaves. And my question is, many white people in America are the descendants of former slaveholders, but many are not.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any difference between these two categories in regard to responsibility for participating in racial healing, or are we the same in this way? Do we have the same responsibility?
Love this question.
I could take it if you want. I can start. Okay, I want to start from the perspective of reparative justice. If we're talking about reparations or what should or could be done for communities of color. One of the things people always say, well, you know, it's not my responsibility to take care of problems of the past, or how do I know? I don't even know if my family was slave owners. Every year we give money to farmers because we need farmers, and we realize the prices or marketplaces are unfair, but we're willing to invest in stabilizing those things. If we know that as a country, as a whole, the nation depended economically on the institution, everybody benefited, every white person benefited indirectly from the system. Some people, that and far more people than slave owners benefited directly from the system. There are people who worked in banks. There are people who worked in insurance companies. There were people who worked in, there was a whole burgeoning industry for just slave clothing where people worked. There were overseers. There were countless amounts of American citizens who never owned a slave that directly benefited from the institution. Therefore, it's impossible for us to excuse anyone in that system. Even the people that came after that system benefited directly from that system.
The response for me too is that race is a social construct. It's not a biological real thing. And my thing right away is, how do we get rid of this whole white-black dichotomy, which is not real? That's the first piece. The second is that people of bright hue who are here in this country need to really deal with the trauma of what it means to be the trauma from Europe, the trauma from the English versus the Irish. I mean, there's so many traumas that have not been dealt with there. And so you can't really understand the traumas of others if you haven't dealt with your own trauma.
Yeah, I would just say that I think that, in agreeing with both doctors on the panel, that I think that we're also dealing with an inheritance issue, right? To Dr. Mitchell's point, where it doesn't really matter if you own slaves or if you didn't. If you have ancestors that were white and alive during that period, you've benefited from it. If you've recently arrived to the United States and you are not an African-American person who descended from slavery, you benefit from this system, right? And not just, white people, but also other Black folks who benefit from inherent, not just anti-Blackness, but anti-African-American politics and policies and cultural movements in the United States. We can look at, kind of even like job application data has come out over and over again. If you have a name that looks African-American versus even West African, right? Oftentimes you're going to be passed over for that because there's a type of attention and a stigma attached to those who are assumed to be descendants of slaves. And to Dr. Mitchell's point again, there were folks that were overseers. There were folks that were selling body parts. There were folks that operated as the original police that were catching runaway slaves. Or we can think about the genesis of the U.S. Marshal system under the Fugitive Slave Act, right? So these are type of not just financial inheritances, but professional inheritances. Many jobs would not exist right now if anti-Black chattel slavery was not a reality. Many medical procedures, right, would not exist, IUDs right now, if there were not anti-Black chattel slavery where Black bodies were captive for racial and eugenics-like experiment. So I think
even if you came after slavery ended, you were still an inheritor of the benefits of slavery. There wasn't a road in the South that wasn't constructed using slave labor and then incarcerated labor of Black people. There wasn't farms that weren't picked using sharecroppers in the South. The legacies, the compounding benefits that were there were numerous. And even today, people are benefiting from that institution or from white supremacy that has been laid as a foundation for the country. There's still people benefiting from it.
But see, I'm uncomfortable again. I'm uncomfortable again because what's happened.
Go ahead.
What's happened again is that whiteness has become the center of the conversation,
right?
And that to me is the problem right there. So.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
But I would also say though, I think that whiteness also becomes the center because whiteness is the genesis, right? Without whiteness, there is no Blackness, really.
Mm-hmm.
If we think about where Blackness is actually created in 1400s in Deutschland.
Well, and that's where I was getting ready to go, Dr. Wilson. Finish your thought, but I was getting ready to go there. Finish your thought.
But yeah, so I think that whiteness has no real definition. It's defined in opposition to how Black people should be treated or the absence of Black humanity. So I think that even we begin to think about whiteness, to Dr. Mitchell's point, whiteness is sustained, right, as the oppositional space or practice or ideology or norm or tradition to the ways in which you treat people who are marked as Black or Blackened. Right.
So whiteness is just the antithesis of what Blackness is.
Right. And then, anti-Blackness funds whiteness and white privilege and white supremacy. We are the living fleshy credit cards in which whiteness is paid and forged and mortgages through. And even when we go back to slavery, thinking about the North, and we focus a lot on the South, but again, the North's industrial revolution, the North's shipbuilding, the North's artisan economy is made through the profits the South sends back up North. How do you make clothes out of this cotton? Right. Whose ships are you going to send these bodies through?
How do you build factories where you get that money from?
Yeah, but your medical insurance companies, your car insurance companies, most of these originate as insuring the enslaved bodies that are coming through the Atlantic. So this is not just a Southern Black or white folks conversation. This is an anti-Black surrounds that encompasses not just white people, not just Black people and anti-Blackness, but every non-Black person of color in the United States as well. We can think about indigenous people that also caught runaway slaves and resold us. There's a long, particularly the Cherokee, there's a long conversation to be had that I think Dr. Kwami's point that we get stuck in kind of the Black-white binary, when really this is the smog we breathe in.
So if I may just follow on, if this conversation should not be about whiteness, it is about Blackness, but it is people like me, white people, that are the problem. So we need to find ways of participating in the reparations.
I wouldn't first describe you as a problem. it isn't you particularly that constructed the system that we're talking about. Yeah. But we have to ask ourselves, if we're going to be honest, how do we deconstruct a system that the United States depends so thoroughly upon and fails to recognize its dependence upon it?
I would disagree. I would say white people are a problem. Whiteness is a problem. There are many anti-Black people that are a problem. And I think that we just have to be really honest about the ways in which all of us, and this isn't to make a universal kind of like, oh, we're all troublesome or troubling people, but all of us, participate in disenfranchisement, violence, subordination, economic wage theft by virtue of the privileges that we have. But for the purpose of this conversation, we're talking about Black people, and that's where the pendulum swings right now, right? We're thinking about the pivoting center of marginalization. But I think that everywhere we can think about where each and every one of us is a problem. But I think we're thinking about racism and anti-racism. White people are, of course, a problem, because to admit to and to commit to anti-racism and admit that anti-racism is a real thing and white supremacy is a real thing, it means there's so much about one's personality, one's economic privilege, and even your struggles, right? It could have been worse if you were Black and there was no slavery, contribute to the world in which we live in. So I think that we do have to say that as a white person, part of your life and part of your existence has been a problem. But even me, I think about my moments of Black anti-Blackness, and those have been very problematic as well. But I also don't think they're equal.
And
so
I would
think
add,
the problem is white people, not whiteness, the concept.
I would think the opposite. I think whiteness as a concept is a problem. White people as existing individuals are not the problem.
Well, that's what I'm saying, that white people, the problem isn't people, the problem is the concept of whiteness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Brendan Smith. He'd like to ask a question.
Yes, good afternoon. I guess good evening, depending on what time zone you're generally in. I hope you're all doing well. Thank you so much for your presentation. Shout out to my first of all, mentee turned mentor brother, Dr. Anansi Wilson. We went to Howard together. But my question, as a person who tends to operate on both sides of the field, that being to say, like, for example, I'm a Wall Street attorney, and a lot of time whiteness is all up in that. But I'm very big on understanding the reality that even though I benefit from capitalism, we can all burn this shit down. Because at the end of the day, capitalism bastardizes our humanity. And at some point, we have to understand that, rage is the voice of the disenfranchised. I tend to think that I've been doing a very good job. For example, like during the Baltimore race riots, one day I was up there with my razor wire bat and a mask on. The other day, I was doing know your rights training for the citizens out there who were, trying to figure out how to get legal representation or know what they need to be doing and doing, recording of the police officers. But just looking forward now, as for example, I try not to spend a lot of my time in the private sector. I do a lot of work with public institutions like the SEC, trying to figure out how to make policies that, like ESG, that focus on making the money, but also do social good as opposed to just doing well. How does one keep that mindset, like trying to go forward and just honor their Blackness and their sanity?
word. From a spiritual perspective, in Genesis, the only time when the Creator did all the creating, after each thing he said it is good, except for the first piece where the heavens and the earth were separated from each other. And there's, that to me was the problematic piece. Those two need to be together. And so when we bring these opposites together and no longer allow them to be separate, that's where the healing happens. And that's what I hear Brother Smith saying, is he's walking in those two worlds where heaven and hell have been brought together, heaven and earth have been brought together.
Well, I loved everything you had to say. I loved all the work that you're doing. I love how you have that dichotomy of, being on Wall Street and then being in the protest. And I think that we're all sort of in that struggle. We have to, there's an economy to surviving in America, but then, like I said, man does not live by bread alone. So there's that need to also be true to oneself. And, that's the balance I think that we're all trying to find, is how do I exist in this country and make headway, but still be able to make a living and look at myself in the mirror every day. And I think you're doing a great job. You know, it seems like you're true to yourself, you're true to your community, and you're trying to give back.
You know, I always think it's important to go back to whoever ancestral models are, whether those are folks you're tied to by blood, by intellect, or by what Dr. McCreary might say, by spirit. And I always think about, for me, that's Maya Angelou. You know, first she says, nothing will change unless you do. You're right. And she also says that, you know, my goal in life is not merely to survive. It's to thrive with passion, compassion, humor, and a little bit of style. Right. And so I think about, what does that look like when it's actualized in my own life? And can I truly be thriving when those around me are struggling, right, or in survival mode? And like, what does community or that carry on tradition, or what bell hooks would call a love ethic, begin to kind of look like? And so for me, I just try to think about, like, what would the people who come before me see about my life, and how would they judge me, right? How would Frederick Douglass judge me right now? Because I think about Douglass, who becomes an ambassador to Haiti, right? After being enslaved. I think about them being appointed as one of the first postal, general people, right? And I think about them getting all these accolades from Washington, and Washington being the bosom of anti-Black imperialist chattel slavery, right? But they're able to maneuver in this space to make Black life more hospitable for the children that come next, without compromising their morals. Because even though they become this ambassador to Haiti, Douglass dies, right, on their doorstep in Anacostia, on their way to give a speech for women's rights, right? And not just Black women's rights, all women's rights, has a heart attack on their front step, right? And so when I was in law school, and as Brandon said, Brandon was my student mentor my 1L year. They were a couple of grades ahead of me. I would often go when I was stressed or depressed. I would jump over the fence. I hope no one tries to arrest me now. But I would jump over the fence, and I would go sit on the porch swing at Frederick Douglass's house, just to reflect on that ancestry, to reflect on what it meant, right, to write "My Bondage, My People," right, or Frederick Douglass, A Narrative of Slave Boy. Like, what does that begin to mean, and how can I hold that true with the ways in which I'm living in 2016, 2017, right? So for me, it's really about holding yourself accountable to the folks that you call your models or your ancestors. And if those folks are not models, finding new ones. And not just historical ones. For me, there's Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells and Fannie Lou Hamer, but there's also Imani Perry and Kiesi Lehman and Christina Sharp and and Cornell Williams Brooks, folks that are living this out in real time. So having those relationships where you can be continually accountable and also sit back and consume the knowledge, right, that comes before you, right? And also understand what it means to have Black joy in the midst of, unending Black death sometimes.
You got to remember, Douglass was thrown in the cross more than once. I mean, I remember him taking over the Freedmen's Bank, and he says, I believe they married me to a corpse, So they didn't give him control of the Freedmen's Bank until all of the money, was gone. And
That's right.
All this money, Black money, was squandered. They put him out as the front man to take the blame from it. Mm-hmm. So you also got to remember, like I said, even the people that we look back on, these ancestors that we talk about, they had to deal with these same sort of struggles that we're dealing with today.
And that's the important part of witnessing, right? When we think about Baldwin and being a good witness and bearing good testimony, that essay, the 3-page essay, The Creative Process, it's not just about you witnessing the world. To your point, if Douglass had not been honest about that experience, we would not have known what these trials and tribulations look like. So sometimes it's about, bearing good witness to yourself, or as Zora Neale Hurston would say, if you're silent about your pain, they will kill you and say you enjoyed it, right? So
exactly,
tell the truth.
I think that those speak volumes of, like, when we take positions for power, or we take positions for, sometimes you got to look at what you're jumping into, Yeah.
And y'all know that better than me. I mean, Dr. McCreary over here, a whole president of a school. I would never, never. I mean, you got some years of it. I can't see that far in the future, but my God, that's responsibility, and that's a type of cross. Because how do you make Black folks happy, but also your donors, and also the politics of the endowment and things? My God, I get to be faculty that's right in my mouth. So
And right
I'd be
there,
glad to have you.
and right there, we're going to have to end it. We have 10 minutes left in our 90 minutes for this conversation. It's been an excellent conversation. But what I would like for each of you to do is give your closing comments. When you give your closing comments, let people know how they can get in contact with you. Dr. McCreary, since you are the president with all those crosses to bear, we're going to give the floor to you first.
Well, it has been an honor, and I love it when there's just rich conversation between brothers. I was over in Oman, and people talk about the oppression of the sisters there because they have to be separate. They worship separately. And when we were eating at one of my brother's homes, the women were in one room and the men were in the other. And I really found the value in that. Both rooms have to happen, and I would love to, for the different rooms. I mean, and Brother Wilson, I just want to say, being queer, brother, speaks to my heart so deeply. One day we have to talk about that, all right? So welcome. And I just, yeah, thank you. All right, I'll go deeper later, but that's kind of cool. For bearing some other people's stories, I don't want to put them into this mix. So those pieces are there for me, and that's all I want to say.
And
Brother Mitchell, good to meet you, man.
Likewise, brother. It's
Yes, sir.
always.
Yes, sir.
I have to reach out to you afterwards.
How can the attendees get in contact with you if they want
They
to?
can't. I got about 3 months. I can't do nothing for about 3 months, man. I gotta be honest. I can because you called me. That was it.
Indeed. Now, your book is Trauma and Race, A Pathway of Well-Being.
Yeah.
It will be released in September.
Yeah, by Fortress Press.
Yes, by Fortress Press. And all of the attendees will receive a copy when it comes out.
Amen. Thank you. Hallelujah. I'm gonna endow that chair, Brother Wilson. Yeah.
I know that's right.
Dr. Mitchell, will you give your closing comments?
It's been an honor and a privilege to present with both of these gentlemen and be on this panel. I love the opinions, even though sometimes my opinion varies from the other gentlemen's. Nothing's perfect in this world, and I'm all constantly reminded of that. But I do genuinely love what both men had to say, and I respect both men profoundly. So thank you very much, brothers, for sharing this time with me. And I walked away learning much.
And if someone would like to get in contact with you, how would they do that?
I've placed my email inside of the chat, so it's available for everyone to see. If you'd like to reach out, it's bkmitchell@prodigy.net. That's my personal email. So you're welcome to contact me there, or you could always reach out to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, and you're welcome to contact me there also.
Thank you. Dr. Wilson, please give us your closing comments.
Well, I'm just so happy to be here. I'm always happy when I can be not just in Black community, even Black queer community, but also be in a space where I'm talking, to Black men, particularly across generations. Because even though I have a lot to say, in these moments, it's so much learning. We come from different generations, we're from different parts of the country. We have different intellectual traditions. And that's the beauty of not just the kind of Black or African diaspora, but also the African-American diaspora. So I just feel blessed to kind of be in this space, to share knowledge, to have a little push and pull and push back, and have my thoughts edified or beat down, and to do the same for other folks. Because I think that in this kind of dialectic, that's how we get to a better practice of Black witnessing, of Black testimony, and Black truth bearing, and instruct ourselves and co-construct a community that is beloved, right, in the way that MLK would say, right, but also in a way that doesn't back down, in the way of Fannie Lou Hamer and Malcolm X and Essex Hemphill and others before us. So I'm happy to be here, and I hope that y'all reach out to me. Easiest way is Twitter. Black Queer Flow, BLAQUER Flow, or my email is anansi.wilson@mitchellhamline.edu. So definitely reach out.
Thank all three of you for participating in this discussion. This discussion will be on the APJMM YouTube page. It's streaming live right now there, but it will be actually part of the collection. I will send each and every one of you and all of the attendees the link so that they can watch it themselves and also share it as well. This has been the Arkansas Peace and Justice Memorial Movement's National Day of Racial Healing event, and this is the Law and Racial Healing virtual barbershop talk. Thank each and every one of you for being here. If you want to learn more about APJMM, go to www.apjmm.org, where we have our calendar. We have events that are going through Sunday of this week. So please check out more of our events. And if you have any more questions, you could definitely contact me directly at Kwami, Kwami, at apjmm.org. That's Kwami, Kwami, at apjmm.org. Thank you all, and everyone have a good night.